somebody else's vacation pictures is one of the most painful things in the world to me. So I come to this morning with this realization of, oh, great, cool things I didn't get to go see. Like, awesome. Can you show me more, please? So I don't personally thrive on that sort of thing. So when I was putting this together, I was trying to think in terms of, not necessarily look how cool this is, but thinking in terms of lessons and things that we learned. So I'll try to bring that out. A number of our folks that were on the trip are here this morning as well. Roy's got a few things that he's going to share in just a moment. And any of the rest of you that were there, if you want to jump in, say anything, offer any clarifications, or when I start getting facts and dates and locations wrong, you guys can fix that for me too. Zach, got it. That's your role today. To make sure we stay on track. So just a second confession as we get started. I don't consider myself necessarily a church historian. I've never, I don't just love facts and dates and figures, and, Luther had whatever for breakfast, in 1519. Just, was it oatmeal? It could have been. I did learn that coffee made its way to Europe in 1515, and the Reformation happened in 1517, so I don't know, correlation, causation, I don't know. Maybe there's a relationship there. So, I never have just screwed out on facts and figures and things like that. But I think for me, I'll talk about this a little bit more as we get to talking about Francis Schaeffer, which was a spot we got to see, which was really cool. I started seeing history as the shaping of how we think. All right, you think the way that you think because of the influences that came before you. And you got to know a little bit of history in order to understand that. And so we see kind of this big sweep of church history and doctrine and things like that. And none of us just came out of a vacuum. We didn't just fall out of the sky thinking the way that we think. We are a product of our influences. So that's important for us to note. And then the other thing that I would say, just as a preliminary here, when we talk about, we did this, and it's a Reformation trip, and it was about the Reformation. A lot of times, though, when we think of Reformation in our world today, we think about a very particular set of doctrines in a very sort of narrow Reformation theology sort of way. What we're going to get to see as we walk through this is that the Reformation, it was doctrinal, but there was also a very heavy political element that undergirds all of this. And we're going to see that the church and the state, at that point in history, were very much tied together. To the point that you see heretics being actually burned to death, or having their heads chopped off, or drowned in a river, like the Anabaptists in Zurich. So doctrine was a very serious political issue as well, and that's what we see coming out of the Reformation. And part of the seeds of what happens in Europe in the 1600s, it makes its way over eventually into like English common law, and you see this big spat back and forth between Catholics and the Protestants for years, and Bloody Mary and all of this, and that leads to what eventually becomes the founding of the United States. And Declaration of Independence is heavily steeped in Reformation thought, and the individuality and principles of conscience and things like that. So it's much more than just a narrow set of, maybe the doctrines of grace or something like that. It's much bigger than that. So there's always a certain danger in meeting your heroes, because, that's the old saying, right? Never meet your heroes. Reason is because you find things out that you didn't necessarily want to know about your heroes, and you learn that they were people, men and women with feet of clay, and had problems and sins and things that you wish that didn't happen in their lives. But I would just say it is okay to meet your heroes. Just we aren't worshiping our heroes. So to the extent that an individual, even in your own life today, they don't have to be a dead hero. They could be somebody in your life today. To the extent that they help you see Christ clearly, that's good. All right, that's good. And we can use heroes and examples in that sense. So we'll walk through this. Backing up, this is a little map here, and we started in Berlin, Germany, and made our way all the way down to Switzerland. So kind of traversed a good bit of the country. And if you're familiar a little bit with Germany and German history, you'll know that that's being in East Germany and East Berlin is very significant. So our guide, Matthias, he was an East German guy. And he had a lot of perspective on what it was like growing up in East Germany. Some of you are familiar with that, and I think many of us are old enough to remember the Berlin Wall coming down, 1989, and all that that brought about, and the division of Berlin. And I learned a lot about that. It wasn't as familiar to me as some other things. I remember it just from being I was a kid at the time, but I do remember some of that. So it was really 1933 to 1945. That was the years in Germany when things went sideways. And so going around Berlin was pretty interesting. Berlin is not very historic in the old sense, all right? Because everything got bombed out during the Second World War. And you'll go around and there's still buildings, and they leave, they actually intentionally is what they were telling us, there's bullet holes, you'll see in the different walls and facades and things, and they leave it, or they patch it kind of intentionally where it shows up, just as a reminder of what happened. And so Berlin is a really unique and interesting city in that way. There's parts of the Berlin Wall that are still around, not many, but there's a few parts. And then, I don't think I put a picture of it, there's a little cobblestone path all around the city that just winds around, where you can see where the wall used to run to divide East and West Berlin. This was post World War II, of course. One other note on Germany in general, and then we'll get into the church history piece. We went to one of the concentration camps called Buchenwald, and I've never been to one before, and I really wasn't ready for that. And I don't know how you prepare yourself to walk through and see what happened at that place, but it was really unimaginable, absolutely unimaginable. One of the interesting things, I didn't get a picture of this, I should have asked one of you guys for it. So out front there's the different, what used to be kind of administrative buildings and officer housing and things like that. There's actually a couple of those, they rent out as apartments now. So you can go live at Buchenwald right there in the front. I'm like, that would have to be cheap rent, for me to live at that place. But it was one of the camps, and many Jews and political prisoners came through there, and that's this was one of the most haunting rooms, the crematorium, where they would burn bodies, and then the dissection table there at the bottom right, and it was everything horrible and unimaginable. One of the things that our guide kept reminding us of is, he said, don't say the Nazis did this, he said the Germans did this, and he was very clear about that. And one of the stories I remember him telling is they actually advertised in the paper for crematoriums to be built. And they took bids from contractors to build crematoriums. And he said, so this sort of idea that the general public didn't actually know what was going on, he said it's a complete myth. They knew what was going on. The people I'm sure there were some that didn't know what was going on, but people in the surrounding countryside, they knew what was going on. They knew exactly what was happening. There's no way to deny that. And so that was that. This is not much to see here, but important to me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was actually at Buchenwald for a short season. By the way, this is another lesson that I'm working on for another day, but I got in an argument with ChatGPT about this, and I won. I'm there at Buchenwald, and I said, "Can you give me?" I said, "Give me information about when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was here." And they said, "Oh, sorry, you're mistaken. Bonhoeffer wasn't at Buchenwald." I said, he was at Flossenburg concentration camp where he was executed. I said, "I know he was executed at Flossenburg." I said, "But he was at Buchenwald," and I said he was there from in 1945, from January to April. I said, and he has a monument somewhere here. And he goes, "Oh yeah, you're right. He was there." And then it starts giving me the wrong directions to this spot. But anyways, I found it. I persisted. Actually, our guide eventually, I said, "Can you help me find this?" And he did. A little off the beaten path, but Bonhoeffer was here for a short while. So that was kind of where we started, kind of in East Germany. And then right after that is when the real fun started in terms of the church history piece. So what I've done is, we're not necessarily going in order of our trip. It'll be loosely based on that, but kind of more in a logical order is what I tried to put this in. All right, so going to Erfurt, Germany. This is where Luther became a monk. Does anybody know the story of why Luther became a monk? Anybody remember? What's that?
Bad storm.
he got caught in a storm. He got caught in a lightning storm. He was going to be a lawyer, so that's what he wanted to do. And he got caught in this bad lightning storm, so he prayed to St. Anne, the saint of protection, and he said, St. Anne, if you rescue me from this, I'll go be a monk. And he obviously lived through it and said, well, I guess I got to go be a monk now. So he shows up at this spot, this monastery, and he wants to be a monk. And they eventually, and this was kind of typical procedure from what I understand, when somebody would come and say, I want to be a monk, they're like, not yet. And so they would put him in these rooms. You see the little rooms up to the right there. They're like, you can stay here for a little while, but we're not sure you're ready. And they would give him a season of time, like, because could be some dude running away from his house, like, I'm mad at my parents, and so I'm just going to go live in a monastery. And they had seen this play out, so they're like, no, we got to see if you're actually committed. Well, Luther, and we'll see this as we move along, once he set his head to something, like, he had a hard noggin. There is no changing it. So Luther committed, and he stayed there, kind of went through the probationary period, if you will, and he did become a monk. That changed his life, and it really changed world history in a lot of ways. So this was his little cell, his little spot, where he would sit and pore over the scriptures, and it's here that he began to really study the Bible. And that would set his life on a unique and interesting course for the rest of his time. So he's a monk, doing monkish things, just wanting to serve in that way. And eventually he hits some things in Scripture that he can't quite square with what he sees in the practice of the church, and that's what causes the problem. Just a couple other pictures of Erfurt. It's a very pretty city. It's got the little river that runs through it. That's the Merchant Bridge. There's actually a church at either end of the Merchant Bridge, which is kind of interesting. And then this is a square. I'll talk about this lower right building in a few minutes when we get to that. This is where. So in Germany, there's a number of Christmas markets. So for those of you so inclined, that's one of the spots where they have the big Christmas market. I will choose not to be there during the Christmas market, but if that's your thing, I'm for you. I know my wife would love that. Okay, so Luther's a monk, doing monk things, and eventually he says, this doesn't square. What I'm seeing in the Bible doesn't square. And particularly, he had issues with the idea of God's righteousness and justice. And he read in Romans, the just shall live by faith. And he said, I'm not living by faith, I'm living by works. How do I put all this together? And so he had that going on. The equal problem that he had was this issue of indulgences. And so indulgences were basically, you could buy your forgiveness. All right, so you buy a little slip of paper, a receipt, you make a donation, and it releases you from a certain number of years in purgatory. In Catholic theology, you go to a holding spot, a purging place, purgatory, and then eventually you're released from purgatory. And so you could buy time out of purgatory, sort of like buying down your interest rate if you're taking out a mortgage. You can pay in advance, and so you could do this for yourself, and you could also do it for those who had gone before you, who had died. And so Tetzel, this guy, becomes kind of the fundraiser for the Catholic Church. And part of the reason why they're working hard at this is they want to majorly upgrade the Basilica in Rome, which eventually becomes St. Peter's Basilica, which I know some of you have seen and been to. Luther doesn't like it, and so he writes these 95 Theses in 1517. And a lot of those deal with this issue of indulgences. And this is where Luther begins to develop his thought. It takes a long time. The Reformation isn't just a thing that just like suddenly happened. It's like a slow fuse that just kind of, it's this flame that just kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And so Luther has now gone from Erfurt, and he is in Wittenberg, and he's at this church here. And sort of famously, the legend is that he took these 95 Theses and nailed it to the church door. Very likely he didn't actually nail them to the door, but it becomes kind of a historic thing to talk about. And so those are the 95 Theses on the door behind us. That's our group. And so that's the outside. This is the inside of one of the churches, and there's actually a different church in the bottom right in a picture I want to talk about here for just a second. beautiful places, beautiful cathedrals and churches and things like that. So it's here from Wittenberg, and we got to kind of put the Reformation into perspective. So the Catholic Church at the time, if you imagine, we kind of think of three circles, okay, if you will, that are maybe touching, but not necessarily. All right, so we have the church, we have the state, and we have the family. There's interlap. These overlap with each other a little bit. But we see the church as doing church things, we see the state as doing state things, and we see the family doing family things. Church has the keys to the kingdom. State has a sword, of course, of power and force. What had happened in the Middle Ages, and years, like centuries before this, is the church and the state were sort of one in a theocratic sort of way. Is how things were thought of, to the point that you had like heresy trials that could end in execution. As I've joked with you guys before, if we had somebody show up here this morning and says, "I believe like Michael Servetus," talk about him later, "I'm not a Trinitarian. I don't believe in the Trinity," I would not call Atlantic Beach Police. Right? What if I called them and said, "You guys aren't going to believe this. We have an anti-Trinitarian here." What are they going to say? Is somebody in imminent danger, sir? Like, is there a problem? Like, do we need to respond? Like, what's going on? Are you crazy? Like, we've got enough crazy people. Like, we don't need this. Like, stop prank calling us. They wouldn't even know how to entertain the question. But if you had called the 911 equivalent in Geneva, during the day, and said, "We got an anti-Trinitarian there," they're like, "Hold him, we're coming." Like, that mattered because imperial law said that you can't believe this. And so that's why I say Reformation principles is so much more than just a narrow set of maybe the doctrines of grace, which is important, significant, believe it, but it's much more than that. It's this concept that the individual has to believe for themselves and has to choose what to believe. So the freedom of conscience. And these principles really laid the foundational work into the English-speaking world, coming from Geneva into British common law, which eventually makes its way into us, into how we think, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and so forth. So these principles, they begin to spread. All right, so then Luther, this is another spot, Eisenbach, or I can't ever pronounce my German things right, and I just wanted to let you know that they have really good bratwurst there. And we did learn that you don't say brats. Brats means grilled. So when you just say I'm having a brat, that means you're like, I'm having a grill. You're supposed to say bratwurst. Bratwurst. All right. So we went to a cool place called the Luther House, which is there. And Roy's actually got a couple things that he's going to share about this. The Luther House kind of has two sides to it. One is really a tribute to Luther and all that he accomplished. And the other side is a reminder of what happened in Nazi Germany, which you're going to see. You'll hear about that quite a bit. So, Roy, go ahead.
I am? You hear me? No? We're working on it. I think you wanted to go chronologically in the life of Luther, right? But my comments are going to take us a lot into the 1930s, a 12-year period that Alan put on the screen, mid-1930s to 1945. I continue to hold Luther in very high regard as a reformer, pastor, theologian, but I went on the trip knowing about some of his flaws. And in particular, in his later years, he had personal struggles, and particularly, most people would say the most troubling part of his struggles were his anti-Semitic writings. Not volumes of them, but certainly a few that have been preserved, recorded in history. And so I was aware of all that going in. What I did not grasp going in, part of which Alan's already touched on, is the strong connection between some of those things about Luther and then Hitler and Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s. And so we visit Buchenwald, as Alan showed on the screen, on a Friday afternoon, and on Saturday, we go to Eisenach. Eisenach and the Luther House was where, as a child, he had done some schooling, I think around 12, 13, right before he became a monk as a later teenager. And so they preserved a lot of that history, but they've also preserved in a wing of that museum, essentially, historical documentation of what occurred in Nazi Germany with the connection between the German Protestant Church and Hitler's Nazi program. And so the German Christians were a pro-Nazi activist group within the German Protestant Church. And it sought to align Christianity, I would use Christianity with quotation marks, with Nazi ideology, aiming to create a Nazified National Reich Church. It embraced anti-Semitism, adopted what they called the leader principle, which was all about Hitler, and it sought to remove Jewish influence. It sought to eliminate any traces of Jewish influence on Christianity such that the Old Testament became basically obsolete in the German Nazi program. And so their influence on Christian doctrine and church practice was intense. And so I just want to document a couple things that occurred historically. There were individual acts of courage within the German church. If you've heard of the Confessing Church, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of the Confessing Church. But the German Christians and the Roman Catholic Church basically prioritized institutional survival. And they would usually remain silent in the face of Nazi regimes escalating anti-Semitism and mass violence. So on Saturday, March 14th, we go to Eisenach, and we spend several hours there. And Alan mentioned the bratwurst, and it was just I'm going through these very interesting personal things where the day before we're at Buchenwald, and as Alan said, you cannot help but be affected visiting a Nazi. You just cannot help but be impacted by that. Then the next day, 24 hours later, I'm having a bratwurst and a beer, and I'm thinking, well, that's fun. And then about a half hour after that, I go to the Luther house. And I go into this wing of the house, I think Alan and others are in there, others had already gone through it, and I'm capturing quotes that they've documented of what occurred in terms of the Nazification of the German church. In Eisenach, in 1939, 11 regional German Protestant churches established, this is an important part, they established, and I have to struggle to pronounce this, De-Judaization Institute, which was the formal, quote, institute for the study and eradication of Jewish influence on German church life. So I'll just read a couple quotes real quickly from the museum. Even though they considered themselves loyal Nazis, the German Christians, that was a formal term for this group of Protestant churches that became aligned with the Nazi program, the German Christians were controversial within the Nazi party all the same. They especially vied with party members who viewed Christianity as fundamentally obsolete and rejected it as a form of detested Judaism. All right, another quote I captured. Since Martin Luther was the preeminent historical identification figure for German Protestants, representations of every political and ideological camp invoked the Reformer, invoked Luther. Nazi Christians viewed Luther as Hitler's forerunner. You could see where this could go. It's a very slippery slope, very dangerous slope. They viewed Luther as Hitler's forerunner. And then this is from a German pastor. He said, no Christians should, we Christians should and must therefore take, well, this is a quote from Luther. This is part of the backdrop, this is part of the foundation for what the Nazis tried to do with German Protestantism. This is one of the quotes they grabbed from Luther from 1543. It's much later in his life, as I said. Luther wrote, we Christians should and must therefore take saving our souls from the Jews, that is, from the devil and from eternal death, extremely seriously rather than lightly. My counsel, as stated above, is first, destroy their synagogues with fire. Everyone who can toss in sulfur and pitch ought to. It would also be good if someone could toss in some hellfire as well. He's basically saying, take down Judaism, any influence of Judaism, and by necessary, light their synagogues on fire. In Nazi Germany in 1938, that very thing happened. in November of 38, they burned the synagogues. And, I'm sorry?
It was on Luther's birthday.
Yeah. So the connection is overt, it's strong, and then 6 months later, these 11 German Protestant regional churches officially formed the De-Judaization Institute, trying to remove the influence. And, I could go on, but there's one other quote from Hitler himself that I'll just read. It's very brief. Well, here's what a pastor said. One more real quick thing. Here's what a pastor said from the confessing church, not part of the German Protestants, the German Christians. Luther was subject to the word, and all his deeds were aimed at wholly binding the church and the world to the authority of the word. Amen. Praise God. Such concerns do not exist for the German Christians. They are not subject to the word, but rather above the word. They decree what of the Bible may still be accepted and what may not. That's a perspective of a confessing church pastor about what was happening with Protestantism in Germany. Here's a last quote from Hitler. He writes this on December 13th in 1941. Any of you historians know this is 6 days after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. A day after they bombed Pearl Harbor, we officially enter World War II. But Hitler writes this on December 13th. He doesn't write it. He states it, I believe, over the radio all throughout Germany. The war will come to an end. The final mission in life, in our times, can then be seen in finally resolving, he doesn't say the Jewish problem, he says the church problem. The organized deceit must be broken in such a way that the state is absolute master. In my youth, I held the view, dynamite. He meant blow it all up. All at once, now take it all down. He says, only later did I realize that this cannot be rushed. It has to rot off like a gangrenous limb. It ought to be taken so far that nothing but imbeciles stand in the pulpit. That's a high bar, huh, Alan? Nothing but imbeciles stand in the pulpit, and only little old ladies are seated before them. That was Hitler's mindset. That was a big part of what they were trying to do. The Holocaust was not just about Jewish people, as Alan alluded to. Minorities, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses were specifically singled out, rounded up, and put to death. And so that's a lot of the backdrop, and I'm trying to process all that, and I'm still trying to process all this today. And here's where I'll conclude this, and then one or two quick personal comments. I have difficulty still at this moment putting into words my takeaways. I'm concerned about some possible parallels today regarding things like growing nationalism, cult of personality, a degree, subtle or not, of the church melding itself with the state. Alan's alluded to how what is so foreign to us, we breathe the air, and in our DNA as Americans is the idea of separation of church and state. I think that may potentially be changing in our country to a degree, and I would suggest, I'm not trying to be on a soapbox, but if that happens, inevitably the church will be subjugated to the state. It certainly was in Nazi Germany. And the tendency today, like then, for leaders and others to remain silent in the face of overwhelming state and government power and retribution. That's a heavy, heavy tone and note to end on. I don't want to end on that. Two other quick personal comments, and I'd love to hear other people. It is so great to go on a trip like this and connect with people, get to know people. I would say for those of you that have taken trips, taken tours, you kind of have an idea of what we experienced. But we had the pleasure, the blessing of Alan's presence as our lead pastor on this trip. Alan brought a devotional element, as Marianne and others that were on the trip 2 years ago remember. He would bring a pastoral and a devotional element to our trip each day and what we could see each day. And I overheard at least one person who was not from Sunrise of these 6 people who joined our group who thanked you for some of those aspects you brought to the trip. It's so unique. It's part of what made this trip so special for me. I very much appreciated that. And thirdly, I'll finish with this. We got to see in Geneva, Alan may touch on, the Calvinists. If you're familiar with the term Huguenots, French Huguenots, they were Calvinists who fled Catholic persecution in France in the 1500s. And when they fled, where they initially came was a settlement here in Jacksonville called Fort Caroline. 10, 15 miles from here at most is where they fled. And they ended up being wiped out by the Spanish, and that Spanish fleet that wiped them out became the fort in St. Augustine. And so I told Alan, a lot of people celebrate the Spanish and the fort in St. Augustine, and I think about the Huguenots getting wiped out. Just a handful of them, women and children were wiped out. Anyway, that's a story for a whole other day. Thank you for indulging me in all this. It was very personal. I highly recommend the trip. It was awesome.
Huguenot Park's still around.
Yes.
Yeah, Huguenot Park is around. And if that hadn't happened, we might very well be, people be kind of pilgrimaging to see Fort Caroline instead of St. Augustine. But they got wiped out by the Spanish, and so therefore St. Augustine became the oldest city here in the U.S. So yeah, very interesting. We will talk about that if we make it to Geneva. I'm looking at the clock. I think we will. Okay. Well, thank you, Roy. You captured a lot of my reflections on that whole thing as well. As has been well said, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does rhyme. It does rhyme. So I think it's always wise to look back and see how could something be weaponized and used for evil, and what should we be aware of and watching for. So I think that's a very good caution. And I appreciate the tension. Even this place, as Roy mentioned, you walk in the front door. If you go left, it's a kind of a shrine to Luther. Like, hey, look at how awesome Luther is. If you go right, it's all these terrible Luther quotes. Right in the same building. Hey, burn their houses down. And oh yeah, they actually did that in 1939. And so they hold this intention, and I think that's okay. I think it's okay to hold that intention because he wasn't, again, he's not a deity. We respect and appreciate, but as a friend of mine used to say, he said, I wouldn't want to be strapped to him on Judgment Day. I'm like, well, I don't want to be strapped to anybody but Christ. So, nobody's perfect, right? Okay, so, excuse me. Luther in Erfurt, excuse me. I guess I was talking to Eric about the pollen earlier. I'm like, yeah, it hadn't really been bothering me.
Yeah, be careful what you wish.
Spoke too soon. So Luther launches what ended up, in retrospect, being the Reformation in 1517. He wasn't trying to start a new thing. The Great Schism had happened back in 1054, where the Catholic Church broke from the Orthodox Church, what became known as the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox. Different branches of that kind of spring out with Russian Orthodox and Coptic Christians kind of come out of some of that. So you have this big schism that happened already. Well, that's not what Luther was trying to do. What Luther was trying to do was reform what he saw as the real church, the true church. But, of course, that doesn't happen quite that way. So Luther gets called. He defends himself in Heidelberg in 1518, a couple other places, and he finally gets called to stand before the big boys. And this is at what's called the Diet of Worms. And it's here that Luther makes his famous speech and proclamation of, I'm not going to recant anything. And he almost didn't go because he thought he wasn't going to be able to actually give a full defense. And he said and he thought he was just going to be strung up. And so he's like, I don't even know if I should go and defend myself. And so he goes, and writings are put before him. They call on him to recant. He says, I need some time to think about this. Comes back the next day, makes his famous speech, not recanting anything. And then eventually he would say, if I recant anything, I'm going to recant that I said the Pope was the vicar of Christ. That's what I'll recant. And so he's a fireball. And so it's here that Luther is, and the building in which he was actually standing, they can kind of it's not there anymore, but it was right there. And you see in the lower right, there's a pair of shoes, and they think Luther was standing right about there. And of course, they let you put your feet in the shoes of Luther to make your stand for truth. So I took my stand there in Worms. People have asked me, like, what's the highlight of the trip? What did you enjoy? And I think Worms wasn't necessarily the most fantastic place that we saw in terms of the buildings and the scenery and all of that. But I think in terms of the history, it was an incredible moment just to be there and know world history changed when this happened, because what you then had is really truly the spark of the Reformation. It was sort of simmering, but now it became clear. It's like, okay, Luther's a problem. This leads to a problem. So there's a guy named Frederick the Wise, and if there was no Frederick the Wise, we probably wouldn't be talking about Luther today. All right? Frederick the Wise was the protector of Luther, very important political figure. And so he was afraid that Luther's going to go to Worms, and he's not going to make it. All right, he's going to get assassinated, actually. And so what Frederick the Wise does, apart from Luther's knowledge, is he schedules an abduction. So he hires a little group, and he actually takes Luther. So Luther's on the road, and he abducts him. And because he doesn't know what's going to happen until this can kind of get sorted out, because he just stood up against the Roman Empire, and they had a habit. That didn't generally go well. It's like telling Darth Vader you don't like his policies. It's like, you just got pinched off. You're done. So they thought this was going to happen to Luther, and so Luther disappears, and nobody knows where he's gone except Frederick the Wise and his people. So they take him to this place, the castle, the Wartburg Castle. And help me out, guys, but if I remember right, the left side's the oldest. It's about 1100s, I think, 1300s in the middle section. You see the three sections. Then the new part is from the 1600s. There in the white part. So this is where Luther, or 1500s, I guess. This is where Luther was. And so you kind of driving through Germany, you see these little castles that are kind of dotted on the hillsides. And it used to be, a way that if you were wealthy, you bought some land and built yourself a castle. That's, why not? We live on the water. They buy castles. So yeah, pretty much. Yes, this is a high rent district, and you buy some land, build a castle, hire a bunch of servants. That kind of showed who you were. So Frederick the Wise has access to this, and so Luther is sort of locked away though. And Luther, being the social creature that he is. This doesn't sit well with him, but he's incredibly productive. So this is Luther's little room where he would sit and write and study. There's a legend about the ink blot on the wall. Some of you guys may have heard this. That the legend goes that Luther one day is writing and working, and the devil shows up, and he throws an inkwell at the devil, and there's this stain on the wall. Well, they keep repainting the stain because it fades over time. It's probably not actually real at all. What happened is they said, Luther, what have you been doing while you were there? And he said, I've been fighting the devil with ink. Well, people kind of took that and twisted it around to all kinds of weird things. But it's hard sometimes to separate reality from folklore. But anyways, what Luther accomplished here, I won't go through all of it, but basically translated the Bible, the New Testament, from Greek to German, writes a number of books, pamphlets, articles. He is pumping out material like crazy. And this becomes a foundational, kind of work that he does. He called it his Patmos, like John was exiled to Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation. He said, this is my Patmos. Well, that lasts for a little while, and he grows out a beard, kind of goes in disguise, and then eventually he keeps going to town because he's doing translation work, and he wants to hear the vernacular. He wants to hear how people are talking and listen to vocabulary. He gets spotted at this little spot. He was going by the name Junker George, Knight George, and he's just sitting in having an ale, German ale, and listening to people. And apparently he's got his original language Bible out, which kind of gives him away. And people look at him like, "Who are you?" It's like, "You're Martin Luther, the guy that we thought disappeared." And so Luther kind of gets spotted, and then he just goes back to Wittenberg. He's like, "Whatever, I'm going back." And he goes back to his church and goes back to Wittenberg. And he's kind of looking at the Pope and the papacy at this point and going, all right, here we are, cards on the table, what are you going to do? But you got Frederick the Wise and some of these other important people who were kind of protecting Luther. And so it's very political. And so they kind of can't touch him. Not because he's got protection shield around him, but it's just very interwoven in the politics of the city at the time. Just an interesting note. Luther wrote a great hymn based on Psalm 46 called A Mighty Fortress. And so when you kind of put this in perspective, it's like he was reflecting on his time at the fortress. The mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. And he talks about the enemies that are trying to assail me and these kinds of things. It's like, I'll never sing that song again without thinking of that. Luther sitting in this little room up there, probably cold, and everything's cold over there. Which, there's just wasn't enough sunshine that first part of the trip for me. But Okay, so the Reformation, the spark is lit, Worms happens, and so now what ends up happening is cities have to make a choice whether they're going to reform or not. And so, again, we talk about, are you a reformed church? We're talking about a kind of narrow doctrinal set, all right? When they were talking about it, they were talking about, are you under the authority of the Protestants or the Catholics? All right, so it's a very different thing, and this was, I guess I kind of knew some of this, but it really came to light as I started seeing this happen. And so some cities would reform and some didn't, and you had to make a decision on whether you're going to reform or not. And so we went to a couple of cities in Switzerland, like Lucerne. Lucerne didn't reform. So Lucerne became a counter-Reformation hub, whereas Geneva was the hub of the Reformation. And so you had these disputations. And then after this all happens, different splinters start to appear within the Reformation. And so a group of people are working to try to bring the Protestants together. And the Catholics are trying to bring their doctrine together, under it's later, like the Council of Trent and things like that really codified Catholic doctrine as we understand it today. But the same thing's happening in the Protestant world. And so they have this very important place, Heidelberg, which many of you are familiar with the Heidelberg Confession or Catechism. That was written in 1563, so we're a little bit later. The first important thing that happened there was the disputation, though. That's where Luther comes and he defends his teaching. And different early reformers end up hearing Luther and get convinced by Luther. And so a lot of important things happened here in Heidelberg, including Zach had his first Turkish coffee in Heidelberg. So, put that in the history books as well. And you liked it, huh, Zach? It was actually good. Yeah. So Heidelberg then, there were various attempts made to sort of bring together, tie these strands of the Reformation together, and they had more or less success with that. The Marburg Colloquy was another one to try to bring Luther and Zwingli together, particularly on the Lord's table, a spiritual presence view versus a strictly memorial view. What's happening at the supper? That was the question, and Luther and Zwingli actually never came together on that. So that's what Heidelberg was. And that leads to next area is Strasbourg, France. And we meet a guy there named Martin Bucer. Martin Bucer has become sort of one of my favorite reformers. He's an underdog reformer, if you will. So Martin Bucer is a pastor, and his strong desire, was to try to do just what I was talking about. Take these different strands of the Reformation and tie them together. So he's pastoring there in Strasbourg. And John Calvin is in Geneva. He's not from Geneva, but he had come to Geneva. And he's pastoring there. He gets kicked out of the city. More on that in just a second. And he ends up landing in Strasbourg. So he goes to Strasbourg, and he ends up under the tutelage of a certain Martin Bucer. And it's during Calvin's time here in Strasbourg that he refines the institutes of the Christian religion, sort of like a Luther experience where he has this incredible ministry there. Ends up pastoring a church there of the Huguenots, those who are fleeing their religious persecution. So Strasbourg's another spot where they had come to, and ends up pastoring a church there before he goes back to Geneva. I'll tell you more about Calvin in just a minute. There in Strasbourg as well is an incredible cathedral. I mean, just like mind-boggling huge cathedral. So you kind of round the corner and there's this cathedral, and your eyes just go up like, oh my word, like it's reaching to the sky. Our guide's walking us around the city, and they're talking about the spires and how these spires are built. And they're like, yeah, they wanted to design a building that reaches up to God. And I'm like, didn't we try that?
Yeah.
Like, that reminds me of something. Careful, careful, don't do that. So this is very Catholic, and it's I want to say the second tallest next to St. Peter's in Rome. So it's incredible, and everything else is short, comparatively speaking. So you kind of round the corner, and it's incredible. The doors, intricacy, the artwork, the clock. That's what was it? 400 years old. It still works. Amazing, just absolutely amazing place. So. Kind of understated there in the city. That's where Calvin was. About 300 people at this French refugee church, basically, is where he was. And then that's Martin Bucer's church in the bottom right. we couldn't get in those. Jason and I took off during free time. We're like, we got to go find where Calvin and Booster were, and we couldn't get in. There was this, I wish this had worked out. I'm there at Calvin's church, and I'm like looking at the door. I'm checking all the doors, like the windows, like the whole deal. And this cleaning lady comes out, and I'm like, "Hey, can we go like take a picture?" And she wouldn't let me in. But anyway, she goes, "No, we're closed." I said, "Well, I said we're just from the States. Just want to come in, like take a quick picture." And like, "Nope, we're closed." Okay. I didn't want to get arrested in France, so we moved on. So that was Strasbourg. So Calvin's there for 3 years. Bucer has a major influence on him, and we'll come back to him in just a second. Then we're on the road to Switzerland, and our guide insisted that we take a picture with the Swiss cow. I don't know, so we did. So we're in the bottom. We're in the bottom now. Getting into Switzerland. Another important figure in the Reformation was Ulrich Zwingli, and I'll just say a couple of things about him. There are two things really that I think are really important. Zwingli was one, so imagine he's about the same age as Luther. So Luther's doing his thing, making a mess in Germany. Zwingli is coming to some similar conclusions and things. Zwingli claims later in his life that he wasn't influenced by Luther, but most people are like, yeah, he was influenced by Luther. So I don't know. I'll leave that to the historians to debate. But he's coming to some very similar conclusions. And his question was, what does the Bible say? All right, what does the Bible say? And so he does a few things. There's a group of people that get together during Lent when you're not supposed to eat things like sausage. And he attends. He doesn't eat the sausage, but he attends. And then he later defends these people. All right, so again, imperial law, law of the land, law of the church, it's all intermingled. And so Zwingli defends him, and it's like, so where's that in the Bible that we can't eat sausage during Lent? And so he defends him, and that puts him, under the radar. So that happens, and then he stops using the common lectionary, and he just starts preaching the Bible. And they're like, "Hey, man, you're supposed to be like we're on page 42 this week, and you're just like talking about Matthew or something. Like you can't do that." And so he gets in all kinds of trouble, and so he's kind of leading some parallel things. Zwingli was a radical. He was a mess. Again, we talked about some of Luther's problems. Zwingli was a known, he liked his women, and he had like extramarital relationships and a kid that nobody really knew where he came from, but everybody knew where they came from. And so it's one of those deals. He's a mess. So again, it's, we take what it is. But the worst blight on Zwingli is what happens with the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists are rebaptizers, so to rebaptize. There's a group of people that become convinced of believers' baptism, that you should be baptized as a believer. Well, that was not the law of the land. And Zwingli, there's two different rounds of this. Zwingli initially kind of defends them, and then he turns his back on when things really turn up the heat. Part of it's probably political as well. And so Zwingli oversees this, and there's two guys, friends of his, and he actually supports them being drowned in the river. So this is what would happen to the Anabaptists. Cold water, by the way. We're in the Alps are just behind us, and or just behind that picture. And so on an icy day, they lower them down into water, they drown them. And this is, again, the law of the land and doctrine of the church have become so intermingled, and it takes years for it to spread apart.
And they were trying to emphasize the irony of drowning them.
Exactly. They're like, you want to be rebaptized? Well, we got that for you. And so they chose that as a method of execution for them. So that's Zwingli. So you got Luther doing his thing, Zwingli doing his thing, and Calvin comes along a little bit later. And Calvin's batting cleanup in some sense. He's kind of a late first of the second generation reformers, and so he comes along a little bit later. And he's also trying to take these things and put it all together. I just got to mention this. We're in the neighborhood, so we stopped off at L'Abri. Personal hero of mine, Francis Schaeffer. This has, I shouldn't say nothing to do with Reformation. Kind of has to do with the Reformation. Schaeffer ran kind of a study center here. It's kind of a loose title. There in the Alps, a place where they would just take in people and you could have conversations. It's still going today, so we were able to sit and chat with some of these folks there in L'Abri. And then I just wanted to show you this picture. I did tell Jason, I walked down to Jason, I said, you do have to come home. That's Jason down there on the rock, and he did. did come home. He's staring off in the Alps. All right, so let's go to Geneva, and let's talk about Calvin's Geneva. So Calvin's there in Geneva for a couple years. The process, remember, Reformation is a political city thing. The process of Reformation has started, but Calvin's moving a little too fast for some of the people in Geneva. And a lot of Calvin getting kicked out was this question of authority, of who gets to decide who can take the Lord's table or not. That was part of the issue going on. And so Calvin gets kicked out of town. He's a visitor, all right? He's not a Geneva citizen. He's a visitor, gets kicked out, goes to Strasbourg, and then they come back to Calvin and say, hey, we need you now. Can you come back? And at first he's like, no. He had gotten married at the time. He's he's writing his books, and he's like, I just want to write my books, and I just want to do my thing, in Strasbourg. You're like, no, we need you, and so he ends up going back. Our guy Jonathan gave us this helpful thing to think through with Calvin and the influence there. Oops, went too far. So